The town square was silent that morning. So silent you could hear the creak of the iron shackles when my father stepped down from the wagon. Every man on the porch had stopped his cup halfway to his mouth. Every woman in the doorway had stopped her knitting. They had been waiting for something like this their whole lives, and now they could not look away. I did not look away either. I was 26 years old, the youngest deputy in Oldham County, and I had just arrested my own father for murder. Before we ride further into this story, settle in wherever you are tonight. Tell us in the comments where you are listening from. We love knowing who is with us when the Old West comes back to life. Let me tell you how a quiet man named Thomas Carter became the most hated name in our town, and how his son learned what a badge is really made of. I was raised on a stretch of high prairie north of Vega, where the wind never stopped and the sky sat like a kettle lid over the plains. My father, Thomas Carter, was a man of few words and a strong back. He had been a Texas Ranger in his 20s, and even then he had the reputation of being the man you sent in when no other man would go. He could track a single horse through 10 miles of hardpan. He could sit a horse through a 2-day storm without complaint. By the time I was old enough to ride beside him, that ranger life had been folded up and put away in the barn. He was a farmer now, a husband, a father. He wanted nothing more than to work his own land and let it be. My mother, Eleanor, was the warmth of our house. She had come out from Tennessee as a girl of 19 to teach school in the Panhandle and never gone back. She had the kind of laugh that made a man stop what he was doing and listen. When she died of the fever the winter I was 11, something in Thomas Carter locked shut. He did not speak of her. He did not weep at her grave. He planted a row of wildflowers along the back fence that next spring and tended them every year, as if she had asked him to. Then, on the 7th of June, the night everything changed, my sister Eliza ran into the kitchen of our farmhouse with her sleeve torn and a mark like a brand across her arm. She was 22 and had gone to the Devereux cookhouse for a few days of work. I was at the jailhouse that night, finishing a long shift. My father asked her one question. She answered him with one word. He set down his fork, picked up the rifle from above the door, kissed the top of her head, and walked into the dark. I got the call at 10:15. A farmer rode in at a gallop, his horse lathered. There had been a shooting at the old Devereux line cabin, 12 miles west. I saddled up alone. Old Sheriff Bell was in Abilene that week, sick with his lungs. I had his badge pinned to my chest and his trust in my pocket. I found my father sitting on the porch of the cabin with the rifle across his knees. Whitlock lay inside, across the floorboards. There was a bottle of whiskey half empty on the table. Powder smoke still hung in the air like a low fog. My father looked up at me when my horse came into the clearing. He said, "I did it, Caleb. He is not going to put his hands on my girl again. Not ever." I dismounted. I took the rifle from his hands. I did the thing the badge demanded of me. I read the warning. I read the rights. I put the iron on his wrists and lifted him up behind me, because there was no wagon and because the ride to town would not wait. The ride took 3 hours. I did not speak. He did not ask for forgiveness. When we came down the main street at sunrise, there were men on the porches with their coffee in their hands. They had heard the news before we arrived. The Prairie Telegraph is faster than any wire. I stood on the courthouse steps that morning and I told them the truth. A man had been killed. My father had confessed. The law would take its course, and the law did not care whose father it was. A woman in the back crossed herself. An old rancher spat into the dust. No one clapped. No one booed. They just watched, like they were watching a storm they had seen coming for 30 years. To understand what came next, you have to know the man my father had killed and the man who owned him. Ezra Whitlock worked for a man named Hollis Devereux. Devereux owned more land than the rest of Oldham County combined. He built his empire the way a wolf builds a pack. He waited until a family fell on hard times, then bought their section for a bill of sale and a handshake. Whitlock had been the muscle, the man who wandered onto a disputed fence line at midnight, who moved a marker here and there, who made sure the deed always favored Devereux. What the town whispered about Whitlock was worse, and they only whispered. They whispered that the ranch cook, a widow named Ruth Calloway, had come into town last spring with 2 black eyes and a broken finger. They whispered that my sister Eliza had walked back to the Carter farm with her sleeves rolled down in July and a stillness in her face that did not match her age. No one in town said the word out loud. Word had a way of walking on its own 2 feet in the Panhandle. The hardest part was not the arrest. The hardest part was what came next. Hollis Devereux came to the jail that very afternoon in a black suit. He set a cup of coffee down in front of my father and spoke in a low, easy voice, as if we were three friends deciding on a hunt. "Thomas," he said, "Whitlock was my man. Sign over the south pasture. Sign over the water rights. Sign over what is left of the old Carter place. I will see to it that the trial is brief. I will see to it that you are shown mercy. A man who has raised good children deserves a quiet end." My father did not answer for a long time. I watched his hands bind and unbind under the table. They were the hands of a man who had held a horse through a storm and held a dying wife through a winter night. When he finally spoke, his voice was the same voice he had used at our supper table when I was a boy. "You are talking about Eliza's home. You are talking about the place where my wife is buried. You will not take it from me. Whatever I owe the law, I will pay. Whatever I owe you, I never owed." Devereux stood. He came with a cup of coffee and a stack of papers, and he was not the friend he was pretending to be. He was the reason Whitlock had walked into our kitchen. That night, he sent 2 riders out to the Carter farm. They unhitched the milk cow. They cut the latch on the chicken coop. By morning, every hen had wandered off and the cow had drifted a mile onto Devereux land. He was not waiting for a verdict. He was already taking what he wanted, one piece at a time. Here is where I want you to think with me, because this is the part one want you to carry. If your family had been broken by something unspeakable, and the law came to take your father, and the richest man in the county came to make you sign away your home, what would you have done? Would you have held your ground, or would you have signed? There was a right answer in mind. I went to see Ruth Calloway that week. Whitlock had broken 2 of her ribs in the spring for serving the punch too cold. I asked her if she had seen Whitlock's hands on my sister. Ruth did not look up from the bread she was kneading. She said, "I seen his hands on every woman in that cookhouse, Caleb. Ask Eliza where the silver scar on her shoulder came from." I went home that night. My sister was on the front porch with a blanket around her. I sat beside her and I said, "Eliza, I need you to tell me everything, in your own words." She did not cry. She spoke plainly, the way you speak when you have already said the words to yourself 1,000 times in the dark. She told me about the cookhouse. She told me about the floor. She told me about the smell of Whitlock's tobacco on her sleeve when she walked home. When she had finished, I sat for a long time with my hand on her shoulder. Then I said, "I will fix this." She said, "You cannot. He is dead. The law has your father." I said, "Do not tell me what I can fix." The first thread pulled up the doctor. Dr. Marsh had been paid in cattle for years, all carrying Devereux's brand. He had signed death papers for men he had never examined. I brought the doctor's ledger home and read it by lamplight. 7 young men. 7 charts, all ending the same way. Fall from horse. Accident. No inquest required. The second thread took me back to the cabin. I walked the floor with my lamp held low. I found a second whiskey bottle in the woodpile, half buried and capped. The label had a stamped mark that did not match the bottle on the table inside. The bottle on the table had been staged. The bottle in the wood had been the one Whitlock had drunk from that night. I carried both bottles to a man in Amarillo who worked with a chemist's eye. He came back the next morning with a piece of paper that said this. There had been laudanum in the second bottle. Enough to dull a man's hands. Not enough to dull his cruelty. The third thread took me to a writer named Enoch. He was 20 years old, the right age for the job because he was too young to know better. I said, "If you do not tell me what came before that night, your name will be on the next death record I file." He went pale as flour. He told me everything. The picture came together in a week. Whitlock had been stealing from the ranch's accounts. Whitlock had been sending letters of his own to a woman in Kansas. Whitlock had been about to be replaced. Devereux had arranged for him to be killed by a man who owed him money, and he had arranged for that killing to happen on my father's land, in my father's house, with my father already primed by what Whitlock had done to Eliza. The whole thing had been built like a coffin, and my father was meant to be the nail in it. I did not sleep for 3 nights. I sat at the kitchen table, and I wrote down the truth in a single page. When I had finished, I rode into town at dawn with the page in my coat and a pistol in my belt. Devereux was having breakfast at the Vega House Hotel. I sat across from him. I laid the page on the tablecloth. I watched him read it. His smile had not moved. He folded the page and slid it back. "You are imagining things, boy. Go home. Be young." I reached into my coat. I set the badge on the table next to his eggs. "Then arrest me," he said. Make my day. I stood up. I am not here to arrest you. I am here to take you to the courthouse, where 22 men will read the truth. If you run, I will put you down. If you fight, I will put you down. If you sit there smiling, I will read the warrant while your eggs go cold. He sat there smiling. So I read the warrant. Slowly, with every name and every date, and the waiter and the kitchen boy listened, because walls in the Texas Panhandle are thin. When I had finished, Devereaux's smile was gone. He came with me to the courthouse, where the judge was already waiting because I had sent word at first light. The trial took 3 days. On the second day, Eliza stood in the witness box, and she told the courtroom what Whitlock had done to her. She said, "He put his hands on me in the cookhouse, and he told me no one would believe me if I screamed. He was wrong. My father believed me." When she stepped down, not a man in the courtroom could meet her eye. They had known. They had always known. They had been glad to look the other way, and now the looking was over, and they were smaller because of it. The jury found Devereaux guilty of conspiracy to murder, of obstruction, of fraud, of paying a doctor to lie. They stripped him of every patent and every deed. The court returned the stolen lands to the widow families. The court sold Devereaux's ranch and divided the proceeds among the 7 young men whose names Dr. Marsh had written as falling from horses. When the verdict was read, I went back to the jailhouse to cut my father loose. He walked out into the sun with his hat in his hands. He looked at me for the first time since the morning of the arrest. He did not say a word. I did not say a word. I steadied his shoulder with my hand and walked him down to the gate, where Eliza and Ruth were waiting in a borrowed wagon. If this story has moved you tonight, you are exactly who we made it for. A like and a subscribe tells us to keep telling them. Ruth came to live at the Carter farm that autumn. She moved into the small room off the kitchen. My father asked her how she took her coffee, and she told him black. He said black suited her. It was the first joke he had made in 3 months. I sat on the porch that night and listened to them passing the bread, and the sound of it was the sound of a house being put right. I stayed on as sheriff for 1 more winter. In the spring, I married a schoolteacher from Canyon who had been in the courtroom every day of the trial. She had passed me a folded note on the second day that read, "You are either the bravest man I have ever met or the most foolish. Either way, I would like to learn your name. I would like to learn it slow." I carried the note home and laughed out loud at the kitchen table for the first time in a year. I handed my badge back on a Tuesday in April. I drove the wagon south with my sister's wedding quilt in the back and my father's rifle on the seat. My new wife sat beside me. The first year of our marriage was the quietest year of my life. We planted a garden. She read aloud in the evenings while I mended the roof. The wind came off the plains in the same way it always had, but it did not carry the same sound. There was no creak of iron in it. There was only her voice, reading a story and laughing at me when I cried at the end of it. My father lived another 7 years. He planted another row of wildflowers at the fence when Eliza's first boy was born, and a third row when her second came along, and a fourth when her third came, and he tended them every spring until the year he did not wake up one cold morning in February. On the morning we laid him in the ground beside my mother, the sky was the kind of clear blue you only get out here in September. The birds were singing. The wind carried nothing. A hawk made a slow circle over the cemetery and then let itself drift away toward the canyon. The world looked exactly the way it had looked the day he and I had ridden into town with the irons on his wrists, except that there were no irons, and no wagon, and no town, and no Whitlock, and no Devereaux. There was only a small boy named after a man nobody in the county would forget, kneeling in the dirt at the head of the grave, holding a handful of the wildflowers his grandfather had planted for his grandmother the spring after she died. The most honest thing I have ever learned came to me on the porch of a jailhouse on the morning I arrested my own father. A man's worth is not measured by the wrong he refuses to do. It is measured by the wrong he refuses to let be done to the ones he loves. Next time on this channel, we will tell the story of a deaf woman sent to a forgotten ranch by a family ashamed of her, and the blind rancher who could read her worth from the first afternoon she sat on his porch and opened a book to a picture of the sea. Until then, good night, friends. The lamp is low, the wind is down, and we will be here when you light it again.